Hello and welcome to today's video. And I changed the subject of what I was going to do today. There was due to be a video on the former border of East Germany and with the security devices that were used to stop people getting out of that country. And instead, because of the news of the death, probably murder, of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition figure, I therefore decided to do this instead, which I hope is the appropriate thing to do in the circumstances. And I thought also to talk a little bit about the opposition, or the chances of opposition in Russia to the current dictatorship and potential liberation of that country. So anyway, the video on the East German border will appear in 2 weeks' time on the 1st of March. And so you can't, as it's a live broadcast, if you want to ask something, doesn't have to be relevant to the subject, then you can do so. Otherwise, I do try to make Fridays though free for the documentary type videos rather than anything else. I'll put the camera. Oh no, it's gone up too far now. That's about right there. So Alexei Navalny was very young, and this is the first time I've actually done a video on somebody who was actually younger than myself. I didn't think it would be him. I didn't think that this would actually happen. I didn't expect that the regime would actually kill him. The reason I didn't believe that is the following. It's often the case with dictatorships that they will leave some of their more prominent political opponents alive but under control somewhere, such as in detention somewhere, and that is to give them the option of a bolt hole in the future. I mean, a very good example, maybe he wouldn't normally have been killed, but was Mandela. And so he spent nearly 30 years in prison, but when it came for a political solution to the problems in South Africa, the then government could actually go up to Mandela and to bring him out of prison and then try and do a deal with him. And these things have happened in other countries as well. That was the first one that came into my mind. But this is lots like this. The Putin would have nothing against murdering the people like Alexander Litvinenko or Anna Politkovskaya and hundreds of others. That isn't a problem. But in the case of Alexei Navalny, who had a following, I think that therefore he was a sort of person who could have been kept alive. To a certain extent, also maybe even Boris Nemtsov could have been kept alive. But I think that Putin realized that by the time that Boris Nemtsov was murdered, that he was never likely to return to having the following that he'd had almost 20 years earlier. Do I think that he'll become a martyr in people's eyes? Asks Anika. Yes, I do think he will be a martyr for many people, because to me he was absolute incredible heroism. I mean, they tried to murder him and he then went to Germany. He had treatment. Now, Novichok, which has been used to murder other people, including Alexander Litvinenko. And then what did he do? He went back into the lion's den, into the hands of the people who attempted to murder him and earlier. And I just don't know what to say about such incredible courage. It's amazing that somebody could actually do such a thing. But obviously he touched a raw nerve with what he'd done, and this was the reason for killing him. Now, Putin has been knocking people off for a very long time, but if you take something even like, for example, the apartment bombings, where was it nearly 300 people were murdered to give Putin an excuse to attack Chechnya in 1999. These people who were murdered were not people who had a following which could then they were, in Putin's eyes, completely they didn't mean anything. They were nameless. I'm sorry, I hope this anybody of the family members of these people understands what I'm trying to say, is that as far as he was concerned, they didn't, absolutely none. They were numbers. Whereas in the case of Navalny, he wasn't a number. He was well known. He could bring out the crowds, and also he came from a certain background which made him the potential of being somebody who could talk. Putin could potentially talk to him in the future. Badger says that the pictures that were published of him in the Gulag reminded him of concentration camp inmates. You can see the punishment cell. For example, there's a punishment cell, a copy of one which has been built in Geneva, and the punishment cell which he was in is like a cage. In the United States, in the prisons, you see they're sort of in cages, but they're indoors. This cage, which is the place is what, about 65 kilometers? What's I thought the name of it now? Carp. It's also called polar fox or something like that, or polar wolf. It's 60 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. And being out in a cage now in February, when the weather, and he was already ill, and he was ill for a number of reasons. The first reason, not only because of the effects of the poisoning, which no doubt was still with him, but one of the things I was just reading on a Russian website now was that because he was forced into sort of stress positions when they were transporting him around, and there's a word in Russian which I suppose it's translated into pencil case, sort of the being trapped in and not being able to move. That clearly had a problem. He had problems with one of his legs, which was dragging. He had problems with his lower back. He was denied medical attention, or he was given drugs which he didn't know what was being put into him. And so there's all of these features, which he said that he was being it was like torture, because they would they'd have to go to work, and he'd be sitting at the sewing machine for 7 hours. But then they had what's termed education classes, and sort of sitting on a bench for maybe 10 hours, being when he's ill and he can't move, and being bored out of his mind. He compared that to as a torture. Furthermore, he was put in a cell with somebody who, and I quote, had a hygiene problem. And this was clearly done also as a form of torture. And what that means exactly, I don't know. I'm just translating that from directly from Russian. Colin asked, did he do it deliberately? Well, obviously he went back deliberately. Did he know they'd kill him? I don't know. Maybe they did. I mean, I've had discussions on the case of Sophie Scholl, for example, is that she deliberately allowed herself to be taken prisoner, to die, to make a point of what she was actually defending against the Nazi Germany. And so did Alexei Navalny offer himself up as a sacrifice in the fight against the fascist regime in the Kremlin. Did he do it for? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I can look a little bit at his life, actually, because he was born in 1976, not so far from Moscow. But his father, was of Ukrainian. In fact, his grandparents came from near Chernobyl, and they'd been relocated. They were relocated after the Chernobyl incident, 1986, and so he seems to have been relatively well off, and because his parents were able to start a small company. They had a basket weaving company, which is not so far from Moscow, and heating came on, and with the he was able to go to university, studied law. He set up businesses when he was at university. One was some kind of a hairdressing thing, although I don't think he actually ever did it. With his law studies, at the same time, he did set up other businesses. One of them was with an advertising an advertising agency. For example, he had the what's it called? Private Sil, the Right Force, that's the word, the Right Force Party, Alexander Chubais, was one of the clients, and but at this time, I think he became aware of the corruption in the regime, and then he started to expose things that he actually saw. Now, the question is, and this is one that many people can ask, is how come you get countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which was part of the same country as Russia was 35 years ago? How come that Russia has fell into this mire of theft and corruption? And this, I think, I can only say that this is the system, and this is that, for example, in Ukraine, this is what people are fighting against. And if you go to Ukraine, you talk to people, you say, we want to, anywhere is what it always comes down to. Eventually, it'll come down to this. They'll go on about the corruption, the fact that the system is such, which has been imposed from the Kremlin, even though they were theoretically independent. But the way that things are actually stolen. The reason that this happened was because in the Soviet Union, everything was nationalized. When it was privatized, instead of privatizing these things to professionals, it was given to or allowed to be purchased by a small group of individuals, individuals which by the end of the 1990s were associated in one way or another with, above all, with the intelligence services, or with organized crime, and organized crime groups which had existed even under the socialist times. Therefore, that was the problem. Well, why didn't they just sell off the oil resources, for example? I understand they had to sell them. They could have put them on the open market, allowed companies like BP, Shell, and Texaco and all the rest of them to actually buy them. These are companies which have see-through accounts, the transparent accounts and all the rest of it. And I think that here we have where the whole problem became later. By the time of Khodorkovsky's arrest, his problem with Yukos was this, that he tried to have Yukos quoted on the stock market in New York. To do that, a certain transparency of accounts is required. As a result of that, if the accounts were transparent, then money could not be siphoned off and go into the hands of other people. Bill Browder, who is a very strong Putin critic, his lawyer Alexander Magnitsky was murdered by the Putin regime when it was 2010 or was it 2011, and the reason for this is what Bill Browder did. He invested in companies, and thinking that because he had the fund which he represented had a 20% share or something like that, then he had a certain right to votes and to demanding explanations what was happening to money. As he didn't get these things, then that was what led to him asking more and more questions, and eventually him being forced to leave the country, the theft of the assets of that company, or rather the taxes that they paid. This is the problem with the Putin regime. Now, I'm not suggesting there isn't corruption in other countries. There is corruption everywhere, but in Russia, it is so deeply ingrained within the system. This is one thing that Navalny actually fought against. So he wanted, first of all, one of the things he argued for was transparency. More than anything else. I'll give you other examples. For example, one thing he started off with was the pipeline contracts. So you'd get contracts. Now, if somebody has to build a pipeline, and how much is that going to cost? Now, when you make a government tender, for example, normally somebody decide, well, it's going to have this, 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 and this, and the most important considerations are these ones. Now, I do agree that there are cases where tenders are made to suit a particular company. Sorry. But in the case of Russia, what would happen is that the winning company would then be huge amounts, not just a few rubles here and there, but things like 50-60% would then be siphoned off and given to somebody else in the administration or whatever. So this is how the whole the system operates, and this allows those around Putin at the top to actually keep themselves in power. Then what do they do with the money? Well, the money then ends up in abroad. It ends up in the United Kingdom or places like the Cayman Islands. Nearly 40% of the dirty money in the world ends up in former British colonies. Could end up in the United States, or offshore facilities in the United States, end up in Switzerland. It could end up in who knows where it goes after that, but it doesn't stay in Russia. Then the effects are, for example, to say, if anybody here wanted to buy property in London, they can't because of the prices are artificially high because of the amount of dirty money that's going into it. These two things are directly linked. And so that is, in many cases, that's not good for the places where the money's sent to. But not always. It depends. I mean, it depends if you're a real estate agent or something like that, or you own a shop on the Champs-Elysees or something like that. Hello, Annie. Then it's not such a bad thing at all. But at the end of the day, you may look at the poverty that exists in Russia, and the amount of wealth which has been expropriated. I mean, we're now looking at something like I saw a figure of over 1 trillion euros, which had been taken by the Putin regime. 1 trillion, that's 12 zeros. Huge amounts of money which has just disappeared for no reason at all. I mean, I've forgotten now the GDP for 2030 last year, 2023 for Russia. But anyway, it's a huge amounts of cash which have just disappeared. Had the privatization process been different, and it had companies which were international companies which had transparency. First thing is that the people who were digging the oil out, or drilling the oil out, I should say, and digging the coal out, they would have been professionals and they would have known what they were doing. That's number one thing. The second thing is the companies themselves would have been transparent, and there would have been taxes paid on the profits, and that would have gone into the Russian exchequer, and that could have been then used to build roads and hospitals and things of this nature. The problem is that under the existing system of kleptocracy, that doesn't happen. Of course, Russia isn't the only country in the world where this happens. There's many places where this happens, and many places in Africa, above all, where this type of theft goes on, leaving people in utter poverty, while the criminals and those in power are able to actually to exploit it. In the case of Navalny and others, what Putin has clearly wanted to do is to make an example, and at the same time as being able to claim that they knew nothing about it. So in the case of Khodorovsky, which is the very first, I think, the very first oligarch as such to be prosecuted, Khodorovsky's crime was that he tried to make Yukos transparent, and as a result, the company was stolen from him. And so it was to make an example. If you just go along with the system, you've made your money, you go along with it, then it seems that you're okay. They don't do anything to you. And so that's how the whole thing works. Another thing is this: on this channel, I've done various films on the nature of the judicial system within the Third Reich. So I've done a number of biographies, and I've talked about how the judicial system actually worked. But it's the same in Russia. For example, when Navalny was he was sentenced by a judge, Margaret Kotkova, I think her name is, and just a few days after that she had been sentenced Navalny, then she was promoted by Putin himself to become one of the regional judge in Moscow. And it only turned out later that the Putin's administrative assistant was actually in regular telephone contact with the judge. Now, that thus making the judge herself part of this criminal enterprise. I've talked also things like, to use John Keegan's work, of working towards Hitler. And I get the distinct impression that we get this also in Russia, working towards Putin. What would Putin want me to do about this? What can I do to improve his bank balance and the number of yachts and things of this nature that he actually has? I know that I'm convinced you'll get all the usual sort of conspiracists and all the rest of it saying, well, there's no evidence that he was murdered and all the rest of it. Maybe he wasn't murdered. Maybe he did die, but it was the conditions which he was kept which led to his death. That's number one. But the first thing, what was he in prison for in the first place? And that's the next thing. The charges which were brought against him only started when he started trying to get people to vote in putting up candidates and then voting for those candidates. He called the Единая Россия, the United Russia Party, the party of Zhulikov и Voron. The Zhulikov is crooks and thieves, the party of crooks and thieves. I don't think Zhulikov is actually crook. It's more of somebody who's a bit bent. No, maybe that's a crook, whatever. But anyway, so it's this which is seen as being Putin's party and trying to get people to do other things. Of course, I mean, Russia itself, whereas it does have these theoretical it doesn't have any opposition as such, and opposition only come on the streets. But there were major protests on the streets in Russia on a couple of occasions. This is something I'd actually say also about the situation in Ukraine, because he did condemn from prison, because he was in prison, but he did condemn the war. I've heard people say that he applauded the annexation of Crimea, which I don't think is true. But what he did say about Crimea is that he wouldn't, if he were president, or he wouldn't, he doesn't think that it should be returned to Ukraine. Because it's not, and now I'm quoting, it's not a hot dog that can be passed around from one person to another, or sausage sandwich, I think was one way it could be said. And he said that there should be a proper referendum, and then people can decide themselves which country they want to be in. And that's something, I mean, I would certainly support that myself. I think that's the fairest way of doing anything. Let people who live there decide which country they want to be in, rather than having like a fake election like they had fake referendum where you got 123% of the population of Sevastopol voting in favor of Russia. And it was totally ridiculous. And they had all that time to prepare the results, and they still managed to make a massive mistake like that. So anyway, so in my opinion, Alexei Navalny is one of the great heroes of our times, and it does come as a surprise to me. I really didn't expect this to happen at all. Anyway, let's have a look at some of the okay, right. So sorry, because I answered some of the questions and then I didn't. Right. So so they are saying, Neela writes that they're saying he fell unconscious and then they tried to resuscitate him. Will people believe this in Russia? I think people will believe. I don't think people in Russia really, honestly, really could care all that much at the moment. It's a former partner of mine said to me, there's a lot of fear, and therefore I think, when you consider, okay, now I'm talking about numbers. When you consider the amount of people who are dying in Ukraine because of this regime, and amount of Russian soldiers, because we don't know how many have died, but it's one person amongst these tens of thousands who this regime has killed. So I don't think that I don't think the Russian people would be all that bothered as much as maybe we are here. One thing I do need to point out incidentally when I speak about Russian people is that the people who supported him, and you can see this for when he stood in the election to be the mayor of Moscow, who actually voted for him, and it's clear from the percentages which we can see online. I dug this up from the Russian Statistical Office website. The voting pattern, and the vote pattern clearly shows that those in the wealthier areas are the people who actually supported him, or so those. As is nearly always the case, the people who are most nationalistic are those who suffer because of it. And so that was the amount of support he got in sort of the rural, poorer areas was really very small compared to what he got in other places. So, and so thanks, Robert. A talk that needed to be done. No, sorry, David and Robert. And yes, Colin says Putin makes a lot of people examples. Yes, it does. Yeah, I mean, with Putin, just the same as with Hitler, Putin fails to differentiate between himself and Russia, or Germany, as the case may be. He thinks he is Russia, and so it reminds me of the what Hess said at the 1934 Nuremberg rally. Hitler is Deutschland, and Hitler is Germany, and Germany is Hitler. And Putin is the same. I'm sure he's after 25 years in power, nearly, he's lost it. He thinks he's untouchable, and I'm sure he thinks he's just doing what's right for Russia, in his opinion. Anyway, so good. Thanks very much for watching. Anyway, they say, Colin says, the Russian Statistical Office, do you mean Squealer from Animal Farm? Yeah, Squealer in Animal Farm, if I recall correctly, was the PR agent of the regime run by the pigs. And Squealer was a pig. So I read 2 months ago, I was in London. I read Down and Out in Paris and London, and I thought what I could do is I could visit some of the places, because whereas the some of the towns that George Orwell mentioned don't exist, they're fictitious, but the places within the center of London are real. So I thought I'd actually do that. Anyway, I didn't. Anyway, I'm going to London on Monday anyway. Thanks very much for listening, and so next week I'll do one on the Oberhäuser, Hertha Oberhäuser, the doctor from Ravensbrück who experimented on people, and in 2 weeks' time I'll do a video on the on the East German border. Colin says, "Don't eat the pastry in Paris." Now, in down out London, Paris, there's this scene where there's a chicken, which is a posh restaurant, and we're left to think it's one of two places. And the chicken comes up, but it's in a shaft, and the chicken falls off and falls down the shaft, and where the bottom of the shaft is probably hasn't been cleaned for years. And then he describes how it was cleaned up and then went back up again. Anyway, all very horrible. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Annika, and all the best from me. I'm in Heilbronn, Germany, where I work at the moment. Thanks. Bye for now.